So what does Russia's delay in declaring this annexed land actually tell us, do you think?
Well, we're into sort of political semantics here.
Mm.
They've passed the various resolutions in the Russian Duma. President Putin's had his big ceremony. So what we're concerned about here, I think, is they are trying to adjust in they call them the Oblast. This is the provincial boundary of which part of these four territories are under Russian control. Now, there's always been a bit of uh, concern about these because these are Soviet boundaries. So, for example, Crimea in 1950s was transferred to Ukraine, and so they want to try and adjust these boundaries, I think, as part of a territory swap, so they can decide which bits they want to keep. So I wouldn't get too carried away as to whether
Right.
this is great significance in the scheme of things. It's a second or third order issue in the ongoing war.
Let's just look at a little bit of this language that's come out today, which could be absolutely terrifying, depending on how you take it. President Putin is set to test nuclear weapons on Ukraine's borders. Now, what exactly does that suggest?
Well, Russia has signed the various test ban treaties with the United States, has never tested a live weapon for over 50 years, 1960s. So, and even then, for another decade or so, they had underground tests. And since then, they've had a treaty that's banned even those. So, what we're talking about is a troop drill involving
Right.
a rehearsal by the troops who operate the launch systems rather than an actual explosion of a device.
Live test. Okay. Russia acknowledged today that Ukrainian forces have broken through its defences in the southern Kherson region. Is Russia actually set to lose the land that it's claimed as its own this quickly?
Well, we're in a war of maneuver now. We've gone through the stage where we had these besieging cities. We've gone through the stage where we had the war of attrition in the Donbass with all the 50,000 shells fired a day type fighting. We're now in a war of maneuver. Each side is maneuvering around in the open with tanks and artillery and troop carriers. So perhaps when you talk about breakthroughs and maneuvers, it's not quite as decisive as it seems. So, for example, at the weekend, we had the capture of the town of Liman, which was a great victory, which obviously they captured the city. That's very important. But all the Russian troops who were in there left beforehand. They weren't trapped. They weren't destroyed. They didn't surrender. So those troops are still in the field. They're still in play. So it's not quite over yet. So, the troops are moving around. Who has a decisive advantage is not quite clear yet.
Is the demonstration, though, of the readiness to use nuclear weapons a direct result of the sham referendums that went on last week? Because Putin now simply, in his head, considers this a defense of Russian land.
This sort of nuclear scares that Putin's used them, 2 or 3 times in this crisis, is, in my view, it's aimed at the West, at the US, NATO, Britain, the countries that supply Ukraine with arms. And it's all about raising the stakes to try and convince the US and NATO and Britain that they shouldn't escalate their arms deliveries to Ukraine in case it spirals the war out of control. So we saw it in March when there was all that fuss, remember, about the fighter planes being transferred, and President Biden eventually said, we're not going to give the Ukrainians fighter planes because it would escalate the war. So the Russians obviously are getting very worried that the Ukrainians have got, are having these victories, and they seem to be using their Western-supplied rockets and missiles quite effectively. So this is a Russian way of trying to signal to the West that if you keep doing this, and if the Ukrainians keep winning more, this war is going to get out of control. So rather than as a real sort of tactic to be used on the battlefield, it's part of the diplomatic geopolitical signaling that's been going on since the start of the war.
And when it comes to geopolitics, what do we think the response would be from the UK, the EU, and the US if this testing of nuclear weapons actually happened?
Well, if the Russians actually used a nuclear weapon in Ukraine,
But before the testing that you talked about before, Tim.
Well,
So running
if they
through the
did,
drills.
if they did a drill, probably not. No one's really going to be concerned. If a few guys drive a rocket launcher into a field, put it up, and then put it down again, does it change the price of eggs? If they actually used one, that's the real threshold, the real boundary that changes what's going on. This is the use of a nuclear weapon. Once you use one, and all this talk about battlefield nuclear weapons is semantic. I mean, we're talking about weapons that have the same size as the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, and that killed almost 70, 80,000 people, injured 3 or 4, 5 times as many, devastated a huge area. So this is something that would be cataclysmic for destruction. That it would just change the whole thing, and all bets would be off. You're talking about the risk of nuclear escalation, exchanges between Britain, France, Russia, and the US. It's doomsday stuff. So even if the Russians were in desperate states, I don't. It's the work of a madman to engage in that kind of stuff. Even if the Russian army suffers a big defeat, it is doomsday scenario stuff once you start using these things.